At my daughter's wedding reception, my new son-in-law raised his glass and told 200 guests that his father-in-law was just a janitor. He said it with a smile. He said it like it was charming. I set down my water glass, looked at the chandelier above his head, and said nothing. By Monday morning, Brandon Holt had a calendar invite in his inbox. Subject line, Lease Review, Harrowfield Commerce Building, Unit 4. Sender, Delacroix Property Group, LLC. He called me 4 minutes after he opened it. That was the beginning. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. Now, let me take you back to where this started. My daughter Natalie's wedding was held at the Ashford Grand on Millbrook Avenue in Scarsdale, Harrowfield, Ohio. It is a beautiful building. 12-foot ceilings, original oak floors from 1947, a ballroom that holds 300 people when the dividing wall is folded back, a courtyard with a stone fountain that Margaret always said looked like something out of a movie. Margaret was my wife. She passed 11 years ago. Natalie was 23 when we lost her. I think about that every time I walk into the Ashford Grand, that Margaret never got to see what it became. I bought the Ashford Grand in 2009 for $1.2 million. At the time, everyone in Harrowfield thought I was out of my mind. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The wedding was on a Saturday in late September. The kind of Ohio afternoon that can't decide if it's summer or fall. Warm enough for the outdoor photos, cool enough that the women in the bridal party didn't complain about their dresses. I wore the navy suit Margaret picked out for me the last Christmas we had together. It still fit. I took that as a good sign. Natalie was stunning. I walked her down the aisle, and I kept it together the way fathers promise themselves they will, right up until the moment she looked at me at the altar and whispered, "I love you, Dad." And then I did not keep it together. But that's not the part of this story that matters. The reception started at 6. Brandon's best man gave a toast first. Standard stuff, college roommates, a ski trip story that was funnier with context, a genuine wish for happiness. Fine. Then Brandon stood up. Brandon Holt was 36 years old, 6'2", with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been wrong about anything in his own estimation. He worked in commercial real estate. He wore watches that cost more than my first truck. He had opinions about wine in the way that people have opinions about wine when they want you to know they have opinions about wine. I had met him 14 months earlier at a dinner Natalie arranged at their apartment. She had been nervous about it in a way I hadn't seen since her college graduation. I remember thinking, she wants me to like him. I remember also thinking, she's not sure I will. He was polished. He was smart. He asked me questions about myself with the practiced attentiveness of someone who had read a book about how to make a good impression on your girlfriend's father. I answered. I told him what I told most people, that I was in property management, had been for a long time, that I'd started at the bottom and worked my way up. He nodded and said something like, "That's great. That's a solid industry." And then he turned the conversation to himself, his firm, his portfolio, his projections for the Harrowfield commercial district over the next decade. I listened. I eat a lot of meals listening to people talk about the Harrowfield commercial district, occupational habit. Natalie watched me the whole dinner, checking my face for signals. I kept my face calm. I liked that she loved him. I wasn't sure yet what I thought about him. 14 months later, he was standing at the head of a room full of our family and friends, champagne glass raised, and he was telling a story. "Most of you know," he said, "that Natalie and I met at a conference in Columbus. What you don't know is that the second thing she told me about herself, after her name, was that her father was going to be the hardest sell of her life." Laughter. Natalie covered her face with one hand. "So, naturally," Brandon continued, "I did my research. I asked around. I found out everything I could about Frank Delacroix before I ever shook the man's hand. A pause. He was good at pauses. And what I found out was, her dad's a janitor. More laughter. Comfortable laughter. The kind that fills a room when the groom is being self-deprecating and charming and no one thinks anything is wrong. I mean, he's in property management now, Brandon said, waving a hand, but Natalie told me he started out mopping floors in some office building downtown, and I thought, okay, this is a man who worked his way up. Salt of the earth, blue collar, I respect that. He smiled at me across the room. A generous smile. A smile that was doing me a favor. Frank, he said, raising his glass higher, I know you had your doubts about me. I know I had to earn this. He looked at Natalie. But I want you to know I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure your daughter never has to mop a floor. The room erupted. 200 people laughing and clinking glasses and ah-wing at the sentiment. I raised my glass. I smiled. I looked at the chandelier. That chandelier cost $48,000. I had it shipped from a supplier in Milan after the 2019 renovation. I chose it because Margaret always said the Ashford Grand deserved to feel like something special, and I decided she was right. Brandon Holt was giving a toast underneath a chandelier I owned, in a ballroom I owned, at a wedding reception I had quietly paid half the venue deposit for, without telling anyone, because that's not the kind of thing I put on a billboard. I looked at my daughter. Natalie was laughing, her hand over her mouth, her eyes bright with champagne and happiness. And I thought, she never told him. In 14 months of dating and an engagement and a wedding, my daughter had never told her husband what her father actually did for a living. I set my water glass down on the table. I said nothing. I smiled until my face was done smiling. And I went home that night and slept 8 hours, which is more than I'd slept in a week. My name is Frank Delacroix. I am 63 years old. I grew up in East Harrowfield, in a neighborhood that the city has since renamed twice in the hope that changing the name would change what it looked like. It didn't work either time. My father worked at the Sivert paper mill for 31 years. My mother cleaned houses, 6 houses, 5 days a week for most of my childhood. We were not poor in the way that gets written about. We were poor in the way that means you don't think about it, because thinking about it doesn't help. I was not a particularly good student. I was good with my hands. I liked knowing how things worked. Engines, electrical panels, plumbing. Invisible systems inside walls that made buildings function. When I graduated high school in 1979, I took the first job I could find that would teach me those systems. I became a building maintenance technician. The building was a 6-story commercial property on Millbrook Avenue, the one that would eventually be renamed the Ashford Grand. In 1979, it was called the Millbrook Office Center, and it was owned by a man named Gerald Ashford, who had inherited it from his father and didn't particularly know what to do with it. My official job title was Maintenance Technician 2, which meant I fixed things: plumbing, HVAC, lighting. I also mopped floors. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. When the floors needed mopping, I mopped them. That's what the job was. I did that job for 4 years. In 1983, Gerald Ashford promoted me to building superintendent. I was 22 years old. The raise was $1.80 an hour. I thought I had made it. What actually happened was that Gerald Ashford realized I was the only person in the building who understood what was wrong with the second-floor HVAC system, and that retaining me was cheaper than replacing me. That is the most common form of promotion in property maintenance. I did not know this at 22. I know it now. What I also did not know at 22 was that Gerald Ashford was in financial trouble. By 1985, I knew. By 1987, everyone in the building knew. Gerald had taken on debt to acquire 2 other properties in the mid-70s, and they had not performed. He had been managing the shortfall by underfunding maintenance on the Millbrook Office Center for years, which explained why I was constantly fixing things that should have been replaced, and constantly ordering parts that the accounting office would hold for 30, 60, 90 days before approving. I watched Gerald Ashford make every mistake a property owner makes when they're scared. He deferred maintenance. He offered concessions to tenants to keep them from leaving. He borrowed short-term money to cover long-term problems. He stopped returning calls. And I learned, not because I was planning anything, I just paid attention. That is what I do. In 1989, Margaret and I got married. She was a bookkeeper. She had a methodical mind and a complete intolerance for imprecision. She looked at my savings account, which at that point was $22,000, everything I had, and she told me I needed to do something real with it. Define real, I said. Something that makes more money while you sleep than while you work, she said. I bought my first property in 1991, a 4-unit residential building on Chester Street, $68,000, seller financed with 8% down. Margaret ran the books. I did the maintenance. We found tenants, we made the payments, we saved every dollar we didn't absolutely have to spend. I bought 2 more residential properties in 1994, a small commercial unit in 1997. By 2001, I had a portfolio worth just under $2 million on paper and generating enough monthly income that I had a choice: stay at the Millbrook Office Center or go full-time on my own. I stayed. Gerald needed me, and I am not a person who leaves when someone needs me. Gerald Ashford died in 2007. His estate was a mess. 3 properties, significant debt, no clear succession plan, heirs who wanted to liquidate everything immediately and who had no idea what any of it was worth. I made an offer on the Millbrook Office Center in 2008. The estate's lawyers told me I was the 5th inquiry and that several of the others had offered more money. I told them what I offered included a commitment to keep the building's existing tenants, to invest in deferred maintenance, and to rename it after Gerald in some form, which is why it is now called the Ashford Grand. They accepted. I closed on January 14, 2009 for $1.2 million. I remember sitting in the attorney's office and signing my name on a document that transferred ownership of a building I had mopped floors in for 20 years. Margaret squeezed my hand under the table. She died 18 months later. Ovarian cancer, fast and merciless. I kept working. By the time Natalie brought Brandon to dinner 14 months before the wedding, Delacroix Property Group owned 6 commercial properties in Harrowfield, 2 in adjacent Fenton County, and 1 mixed-use development we had just broken ground on near the river. Net asset value, last appraisal, $14.3 million. I did not say this at dinner. Natalie knew. She grew up watching me work. She spent summers in property offices and walked job sites with me. She understood, better than almost anyone, exactly what her father did and what it was worth. She chose not to tell her husband. I had 14 months to wonder why. The wedding gave me the answer. I did not confront Natalie the night of the wedding. I am not a person who confronts people when I am still feeling things. Margaret used to say that was both my best quality and my most frustrating one. Frank, she would say, sometimes a person needs to know they hurt you before you finished processing it. I understood her point. I was never able to change. I drove home from the Ashford Grand at 11:15. I hung up the navy suit. I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and the yellow legal pad I keep for thinking problems through. At the top of the page, I wrote, "What did Brandon mean?" Under that, I wrote, "What did Natalie mean?" They are different questions. Brandon didn't mean anything, not really. He did not know he was being condescending because he did not know there was anything to be condescending about. He had been given a partial picture. Father, janitor, property management, worked his way up, and he assembled it into the story that made sense to a man like him. A blue-collar origin story. Respectable but uncomplicated. Not something you need to update your understanding of. Natalie gave him that picture. She gave him only that picture. I sat with that for a while. The sound of the fountain in the backyard, a small stone one I installed the summer after Margaret died because the yard was too quiet, was the only sound in the house. I thought about the dinners I had attended at their apartment over the past year, the way Brandon spoke about the commercial real estate market in Harrowfield, his opinions on which buildings were undervalued, which landlords were running operations poorly, which properties would be worth acquiring if the right opportunity came along. He had said all of this directly to me, the owner of 6 commercial properties in Harrowfield, without knowing I was the owner of 6 commercial properties in Harrowfield. I thought about whether Natalie had been in the room for those conversations. She had been. I wrote a third question on the legal pad. Why? I had 3 theories. The first theory was simple embarrassment. That Natalie had fallen in love with a man who placed significant value on a certain kind of professional status, and that she had calculated, consciously or not, that his image of her family needed to be managed. A father in property management sounds like a rental agent. A father who owns $14 million in commercial property sounds like a landlord who might have opinions about her husband's career. The second theory was protection. That Natalie knew, somewhere in her understanding of Brandon, that telling him would change something, that the money would become a factor, that he would see her and her father differently. And she preferred the version of their relationship where it wasn't a factor. The third theory was the one I didn't want to think about, that she was ashamed, not of me exactly, but of the gap, of explaining to a man who went to Denison University and had business cards with a gold logo that her father's money came from a building he used to mop, that the story was messy and working class and didn't translate cleanly into the world she was building with Brandon Holt. I looked at the legal pad for a long time. Then I looked at the second item on it, which I had written before the theories. Harrowfield Commerce Building, Unit 4. Brandon Holt's new restaurant. Let me tell you about that. 3 months before the wedding, Natalie had mentioned, with careful casualness, that Brandon was opening a restaurant. A steakhouse, upscale, targeting the downtown Harrowfield professional demographic. He had found a space he loved, great bones, high ceilings, good foot traffic. He was in early lease negotiations. I asked which building. She named it. I own that building. I have owned it since 2014. It was previously 3 separate commercial units on the ground floor. I combined them into one larger space in 2017, after the previous anchor tenant moved out. The combined unit sat empty for almost 2 years before I leased it in 2019 to a kitchen and bath showroom that had done reasonably well until they consolidated locations last spring. The unit was vacant when Brandon found it. My property manager, Sandra, handles all initial inquiries. She never mentions my name in negotiations. There's no particular reason for this. It's just how I've always operated. Delacroix Property Group appears in the lease documents, but by the time you're signing a lease, you've already made your decisions. Brandon had been negotiating with Sandra for 6 weeks before the wedding. He didn't know who owned the building. Sandra didn't know she was negotiating with my daughter's fiancé until I mentioned it to her the Monday after the wedding. She called me immediately. "Frank," she said, "you knew this whole time?" "I knew at the rehearsal dinner," I said. "Natalie mentioned the address." "What do you want to do?" I thought about a $48,000 chandelier and a man with a champagne glass who had done me a favor by calling me a janitor in front of 200 people. "Nothing yet," I said. "Send the standard lease renewal package. Let the process run normally." "Understood," Sandra said. She has worked for me for 14 years. She asked no further questions. The lease for Unit 4 at the Harrowfield Commerce Building had not been finalized before the wedding. Brandon was still negotiating terms, primarily the base rent figure and the tenant improvement allowance. Sandra had been offering what I considered fair market terms for a ground-floor commercial space in that corridor. $28 per square foot annually, 18-month TI allowance, 5-year initial term with 2 renewal options. Brandon had countered at $23 per square foot, a larger TI allowance, and a request for a personal guarantee waiver. In my experience, there are 2 kinds of people who negotiate commercial leases. The first kind is someone who has studied the market, knows what comparable spaces are renting for, and makes a principled case for an adjusted figure. The second kind is someone who assumes that the asking price is a formality and that confident pushback will always yield a concession. Brandon was the second kind. He had sent Sandra 3 emails in the final 2 weeks before the wedding, each one more assured than the last, each one referencing his background in commercial real estate as context for why his perspective on market rates was particularly informed. Sandra had forwarded me all 3 emails. I read them carefully. The market rate for that corridor was $27 to $30 per square foot. I knew this because I had leased 3 comparable units in adjacent buildings in the past 18 months. Brandon's number, $23, was not a principled counter. It was a wish. His reasoning, as laid out in email 3, was that the space had sat vacant for over a year, that this indicated a pricing problem, and that the smart play for ownership would be to accept a below-market tenant who would activate the space, rather than wait indefinitely for an above-market deal. The argument was not entirely wrong. Vacant space costs money. A below-market tenant is better than no tenant in many circumstances. The argument was also, in this particular circumstance, being made by my son-in-law to my property manager about a space he intended to fill with a business I had not been told about until my daughter mentioned it casually at dinner. I was not offended by the negotiating position. I was interested in it. On Tuesday morning, 3 days after the wedding, I called Sandra. "Offer him the market rate," I said, $28.50 per square foot. Standard TI, full personal guarantee required. Tell him ownership has completed its review and this is the final position. Sandra paused. "He's not going to like that." "I know. He may walk." "If he walks, but I don't think he will. He's been building this concept for 18 months. He's already told people. He's already ordered equipment, probably. Men like Brandon Holt don't walk away from things they've announced." Another pause. "Do you want me to keep your name out of it?" "For now," I said, "let's see what he does." What Brandon did was call Sandra and tell her ownership was being unreasonable. She remained professional and reiterated the terms. He emailed 3-paragraph response explaining why the market supported his counter. He included a comparative analysis of 2 other buildings on Millbrook Avenue. One of those buildings, I noted, was also mine. Sandra forwarded everything. I read it on a Thursday evening, sitting on my back porch. The fountain was running. The September air was starting to carry a bite. I approved one small concession. I would cover the cost of the HVAC inspection, which Brandon had flagged as a concern. Because the HVAC in that unit was indeed aging, and I had already planned to service it before any new tenant moved in. This was not a negotiating gesture. It was honest. I told Sandra not to explain the reasoning, just to say ownership would cover the inspection. Brandon took it as a victory. He emailed back within 40 minutes saying he appreciated the gesture and was prepared to move forward if ownership would meet him at $25. Sandra replied that the figure was $28.50 and not subject to further adjustment. 11 days passed. On a Monday morning, exactly 16 days after the wedding, Sandra sent me a message at 7:42 a.m. "He's ready to sign at your terms. Wants to proceed with full package." I read the message. I set down my coffee. I thought about Natalie's face at the reception, laughing while her husband told 200 people her father mopped floors. I wrote back to Sandra, "Before we proceed, please send the executed lease summary to my email as well." Delacroix Property Group letterhead. CC me on the cover note." Sandra understood immediately. She has worked for me for 14 years. At 9:15 a.m., Brandon Holt received an email from Sandra. Attached was the proposed lease summary. CC'd on the email, per standard closing procedure, was Frank Delacroix, Principal, Delacroix Property Group, LLC. At 9:19 a.m., I received a call from Brandon. I let it ring. At 9:22 a.m., he called again. I answered on the third ring, the way I always answer calls I've been expecting. "Brandon," I said, "congratulations on the upcoming opening." There was a silence on his end that lasted almost 4 seconds. In a phone conversation, 4 seconds is a very long time. "Frank," his voice was careful, controlled. The voice of a man in commercial real estate who had just realized he had been negotiating with his father-in-law for 6 weeks without knowing it. "I'm looking at this email. I see that," I said. "Delacroix Property Group, that's your company." "It is." Another silence. "You own the Commerce Building." "Among others," I said. Brandon asked me, in a voice that was doing significant work to remain steady, why I hadn't mentioned this earlier. I told him the truth, because it wasn't relevant until it was. He asked what I meant by that. I said that property negotiations proceed better when both parties are focused on the merits of the deal rather than on personal relationships. That I had let Sandra handle it because that was her job and she does it well. That nothing in the process had been done improperly. "But you knew," he said, "you knew for weeks that I was negotiating to lease your building." "I did." "And you never said anything?" "You never asked who owned it," I said. "That's standard due diligence in commercial real estate. I'm sure you know that." The silence this time was different. It had texture. "Frank." His voice had shifted. The professional control was still there, but something else was in it now. Something that was either anger or embarrassment, and might have been both. "I want to be straightforward with you. I don't know if I'm comfortable moving forward with this lease, given the circumstances." "That's your call," I said. "Sandra can walk you through the exit process if you decide not to proceed. The space will lease. It's a good space." He didn't say anything for a moment. "Was this—" He stopped, started again. "Did Natalie know?" "Natalie has always known what her father does," I said. "What she's told you about it is between the two of you." I heard him exhale. "I'm going to call her," he said. "I'd expect so," I said. "Frank," one more pause. "The comment at the reception, the toast." "Yes." "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I said. "Brandon, I want to be clear about something. I don't have quarrel with you. You made a toast at your wedding. You worked with the information you had. What I'd like to talk to Natalie about, when she's ready, is why the information you had was incomplete." He was quiet. "Send Sandra your decision about the lease by end of week," I said. "Whatever you decide, I wish you well with the restaurant." I ended the call. 40 minutes later, my phone rang. Natalie. My daughter's voice, when she called, was the voice of someone who had been crying and was trying not to anymore. "Dad, hi, sweetheart. Brandon called me. I figured." She was quiet for a moment. I could hear her breathing. I thought about the wedding. Her face when she walked down the aisle. The way she whispered, "I love you, Dad," at the altar, and I did not keep it together. "Why didn't you tell him?" she asked. "I'd like to ask you the same question," I said. A long pause. It never came up naturally," she said. "When we first met, I mentioned you were in property management, and he kind of assumed, and then I didn't correct him, and then so much time went by that correcting it felt weird, like a big reveal. I didn't want it to be a thing." "What kind of thing?" Silence. "Natalie." "I didn't want him to think—" She stopped. "Brandon cares a lot about what he's built, who he is professionally. I didn't want him to feel like he was measuring himself against you without knowing he was doing it." "That's thoughtful of you," I said. toward him. She heard what I didn't say. "Dad, I'm sorry about the toast. I didn't know he was going to say that." "I know you didn't." "I should have told him. I know that. I kept waiting for the right moment, and then it felt like the moment was past, and—" Her voice broke slightly. "I'm sorry." I sat with that for a moment. The fountain in the backyard, the sound of a Tuesday morning in Harrowfield. "Can I tell you something?" I said. "Yes?" "When I was 22 years old, I was a building superintendent making $11 an hour. Your grandmother cleaned houses. Your grandfather worked a paper mill. That is where we came from. It was not something I was ashamed of, and it is not something I want you to be ashamed of." "I'm not ashamed," she said quickly. "I know, but I think you were managing something, and I'd ask you to be careful about that going forward, because what you manage becomes what you hide, and what you hide has a way of getting complicated." She was quiet. "Natalie, I am not angry with you. I am your father, and I love you, and that is not conditional. What I'd like, when you're ready, is a conversation, a real one, with both of you." "Okay," she said. Her voice was small. "And I'd like you to tell him the rest," I said. "The rest?" "He knows about the Commerce Building. There's more to know." Another silence. "How much more?" she asked. "More than he was expecting," I said. "They came to the house on a Saturday. Brandon wore a jacket. He brought a bottle of wine, a good one, which I noted. He shook my hand at the door and held eye contact, which told me he had done some thinking in the preceding days and had decided that the thing to do was face this directly. I respected that. I don't always like Brandon Holt, but I can respect a man who decides to face something directly. Natalie hugged me for a long time. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had sat with a yellow legal pad 16 days earlier. I made coffee. Brandon declined. Natalie accepted. I let them settle. Then I opened the folder I had placed on the table before they arrived, and I told Brandon Holt what Delacroix Property Group was. I did not do it to impress him. I did not do it to embarrass him. I did it because it was information he was entitled to have, and because going forward, as my son-in-law, as the tenant of one of my properties if he chose to proceed, as a member of my family, it was better to operate from fact than from assumption. I went through it methodically. 6 commercial properties in Harrowfield, 2 in Fenton County, the river development, the residential portfolio I still carried, the approximate asset value, the annual revenue. When I finished, Brandon was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you tell me any of this?" he asked. Accusatory. Genuinely asking. "You didn't ask," I said, "and the time we spent together, you spent talking about your work. I listened. That's what I do. I listen, and I learn, and I figure out what I'm dealing with. I do that with tenants, and I do that with people." He absorbed this. "The toast," he said, "at the reception. We don't need to revisit that." "I want to," he said. "I said something that I meant it as a compliment. Working your way up from nothing, I genuinely respect that. But it landed wrong." "It landed as what it was," I said. "A man who thought he knew the whole story, telling the room the story. It happens. The issue isn't the toast." "What's the issue?" I looked at Natalie, then back at him. "The issue is that my daughter has been managing a version of me that fits more easily into your life, and I'd like that to stop." The table was quiet. Natalie set down her coffee cup. "I know," she said softly. "I know." Brandon looked at his wife for a long moment, then at me. Then he nodded, a single, slow nod that meant something real. "The lease," he said. "Do you still want to proceed?" "If you do," I said, "at the agreed terms." He almost smiled. Almost. $28.50. $28.50, I confirmed. He was quiet again. Then, You could have used this differently, Frank. The whole situation. You had a lot of options. I know. Why didn't you? I thought about Margaret, about what she would have said, sitting at this table, watching her husband and her son-in-law find the edges of what they were to each other. Because you're married to my daughter, I said, and I'm interested in a relationship that can last 30 years, not in winning an argument. Brandon signed the lease 11 days later, $28.50 per square foot, standard TI, full personal guarantee. He had his lawyer review every clause. I'd expected nothing less. The restaurant opened the following spring. I attended the soft opening with my sister Rosa and her husband. The food was good. Brandon shook my hand at the door and showed me a table near the window. He comped the meal. I left a 20% tip on the full ticket price anyway, because I believe in paying what things are worth. I did not tell anyone at the table that I owned the building. That's not the kind of thing I put on a billboard. Natalie and I had dinner alone, twice, in the months after that Saturday at my kitchen table. Real dinners. Long ones. The kind where the food gets cold because the conversation is more important. She told me things I hadn't known. About the early days with Brandon, when she had been so afraid of getting it wrong. About the story she had built in her head about what he needed her family to be. About the moment she couldn't name exactly when the story had calcified into something she didn't know how to revise. I listened. I did not tell her she was wrong to feel what she had felt. I told her the truth was simpler to carry than the version she'd been managing. She said she was starting to understand that. Brandon and I have not become friends. I don't think we will. But we have become something. Two people who know where they stand with each other, who operate from fact, who can sit at the same table and have a direct conversation. That is more than many families manage. I still sit on the back porch in the evenings. The fountain runs. The yard is quiet in the way it's been quiet since Margaret left. I have learned to find the quiet useful rather than heavy. Sometimes I think about that chandelier. $48,000 shipped from Milan, hanging in a building I bought with $11 an hour saved over 20 years, in a city where my father worked a paper mill and my mother cleaned houses. I think Margaret would have liked to see it. I think she already knows. If this story moved you, please subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Click the box on the left for the next story.